moment our son stepped into the dim hallway that night. His eyes carried a darkness I had never seen on his face before, calculated, cold, and terrifyingly sure of itself. And when he quietly locked the door behind him, my husband's fingers brushed mine under the table, trembling just enough for me to feel the warning in his touch as he whispered, "Act scared, no matter what he says." My breath stalled. The house felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves understood we were moments away from hearing something that would change the shape of our family forever. Shadows stretched across his expression as he approached us, each step echoing like a countdown. And I could already sense that whatever he wanted tonight wasn't love, wasn't reconciliation. It was something sharpened and dangerous. And in that suspended moment, before I allowed myself to fully look at him, I knew I had to steady my voice, steady my heart, because what was coming next wasn't a plea, it was a threat. "My name is Janet. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard, and drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening." The night began quietly, too quietly, as if silence itself was preparing me for the storm our son was about to unleash. A storm that would expose the truth about inheritance, desperation, and the frightening lengths a loved one might go when blinded by the promise of wealth. And as he stepped closer, I could see it. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to take. He stood before us, the lamp casting a thin gold blade across his jaw, highlighting how tense it had become. And for a moment, I searched his expression for the boy I once held against my chest on sleepless nights. But all I found was a hardened stranger rehearsing a speech he had already justified to himself 1,000 times. He inhaled slowly, and when he exhaled, the warmth that once lived in his voice was gone, replaced by a chilling composure as he said, "I know about the will." My husband's hand barely twitched beside me, just enough for me to sense the storm roaring beneath his silence, and I forced myself to breathe as our son continued, each sentence falling heavier than the last. He told us he had seen the documents, told us he knew exactly who would inherit what, told us he deserved much more. And as the words spilled out, the room tightened around us, shrinking with every confession he delivered like a verdict. The clock on the wall ticked with an unnervingly steady rhythm, its sound almost mocking the unraveling taking place before it. And when he stepped closer, the wooden floor let out a soft groan, as if even the house recoiled from the change in him. My husband, eyes lowered to hide the fire building behind them, whispered so faintly only I could hear, "Stay calm." And I felt it then, how fragile the moment was, how a single wrong reaction could snap the tension like thin glass. Our son's gaze locked onto mine, unwavering, unblinking, carrying a resolve he had no right to wield against the parents who had given him everything we could. And he said, with a steadiness that chilled my blood, "I'm not leaving this house until you fix it. I want my share tonight." His words hung between us like a drawn blade, and suddenly, the future of our family wasn't a gentle horizon. It was a narrow, dangerous path we would have to walk with careful steps, because the son we raised was no longer asking. He was demanding the moment he said, "Tonight." Something inside the room shifted, an invisible crack running through the air, through the years of memories, through every photograph on the walls that had once captured his smile. And I watched him place his palms on the table with a slow, deliberate pressure, as if he were anchoring himself into a decision he could no longer turn away from. The wood creaked beneath his touch, and in that sound, I heard the final confirmation that this was no emotional outburst. It was a plan. My husband lifted his eyes, just enough for me to see the calculation behind them, the quiet strength he was readying as he whispered once more, barely a breath, "Act scared. It's the only way to see what he really wants." My pulse hammered against my ribs, echoing the rhythmic flicker of the hallway light that suddenly dimmed, then flared, casting fractured shadows across our son's face, revealing an unsettling blend of certainty and fear, as though he too was unsure how far he was willing to go. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a sharp whisper meant to intimidate, saying he was done waiting, done being overlooked, done feeling like the least important. Child words that sliced deeper because they were built on a pain he had never spoken aloud until tonight. The silence afterward was suffocating, heavy enough to make the curtains tremble from the faint draft sneaking through the window frame. And as he straightened up, pacing slowly in a tight circle like someone guarding their claim, he added something that lodged itself into my chest like a splinter. "I'm not the villain here. I'm taking what's mine." And in that instant, with his voice echoing through the dim room and the weight of his intentions settling like dust across every surface, I realized the truth clawing its way to the surface. This wasn't simply about money. This was about a wound we never saw, a resentment that had grown quietly, dangerously, and tonight it had finally stepped into the light, fully formed, demanding to be faced. He began pacing the length of the living room with a slow, predatory rhythm, each step measured, controlled, as if he were rehearsing dominance rather than expressing pain. And the soft thud of his footsteps blended with the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, mundane sounds made unnervingly sharp by the tension threading through every second. My eyes followed him carefully, memorizing every shift in his posture, every flicker of thought crossing his tightened jaw, because I needed to understand whether this was anger or a breaking point. My husband sat impossibly still beside me, a quiet mountain bracing against an approaching storm. And when our son stopped abruptly and turned toward us, his silhouette caught in the dim glow of the floor lamp, he said something that tightened the cold around my spine. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. He told me I have options if you both refuse." The audacity of the sentence sucked the warmth out of the room, and the shadows on the walls deepened, stretching toward him like echoes of the threat he had just revealed. I felt my husband's fingers lightly tap the underside of my chair, our silent signal that he needed me steady, composed, watchful. Our son continued speaking, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and conviction, telling us how he had spent years feeling sidelined, how he believed we always favored his brother and sister, how he thought the will was proof of a love he never truly had. And as he spoke, I realized the danger wasn't only in his threat, it was in the pain fueling it, a pain he had nurtured in silence till it twisted into something unrecognizable. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the sheen in his eyes, not from tears, but from the intensity of a decision he had convinced himself was righteous. And he said, in a low, unyielding voice, "I'm tired of being the one left with nothing." The moment those words left his lips, the air seemed to narrow around us, as though the entire house held itself still, waiting to see what we would say next, because the wrong response could ignite him, and the right one might reveal the truth behind the threat, hovering heavily between us. He stood so close now that I could hear the uneven drag of his breathing, the way each inhale seemed to scrape against the anger sitting in his chest. And when he leaned forward slightly, the overhead light caught the faint tremor in his fingers, subtle but unmistakable, revealing that beneath the force he tried so hard to wield, There was a fragile turbulence threatening to split him open. My husband shifted just enough for our son not to notice, angling his body toward him with the calm precision of a man preparing for an emotional detonation. And I watched the reflection of our son's shadow ripple across the glass cabinet behind him, like a warning of the darkness he carried tonight. He pressed his lips together before speaking, as if weighing whether to soften his voice or sharpen it further. And ultimately, he chose the blade. "If you had treated me like the others," he said, his tone icy, "I wouldn't be standing here demanding what should have been mine from the beginning." The accusation struck the air with a force that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, and for a second, I felt my own heartbeat stumble, not from fear of him, but from the realization that the story he carried in his mind, the one where he had always been the forgotten child, was a story we had never been allowed to see. My husband exhaled slowly, steadying the rising heat beneath his calm exterior, and he lowered his voice into a tone only a father can master, deep enough to hold authority, yet gentle enough to avoid lighting a fuse, saying, "What you think we took from you, say it plainly." Our son stiffened, his stare sharpening with a flare of defensiveness, as though being asked to speak the truth aloud forced him to confront it in a way he feared, and he swallowed hard before responding. "My future," he whispered first, then louder. "You took my future by giving everything to them." His voice wavered on the last word, trembling under the weight of a belief he had nurtured for years. And suddenly, he wasn't a threat standing over us. He was a wounded man trying to rewrite the story of his worth with anger, because he didn't know how to ask for love. The silence afterward settled thickly around all three of us, a silence that didn't frighten me, but warned me, because now that we finally heard the wound beneath his threat, we had to decide whether we would confront the pain he carried, or the danger it had become. The room felt smaller as his words lingered, shrinking inward, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what he had just confessed. And for a moment, he broke eye contact, glancing toward the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Our three children frozen in a summer smile, sunlight in their hair, innocence untouched by shadows. And I watched his jaw tighten, as if the image itself was a wound. He clenched his fists, not in aggression, but in a desperate effort to hold himself together. And when he finally looked back at us, something in his expression had shifted, the anger still burning, but now threaded with a raw, trembling vulnerability he couldn't hide. My husband leaned forward slightly, steady but unyielding, the lamp behind him casting a soft outline around his shoulders, like a frame of restrained strength. And he said, with a calm that carried both firmness and sorrow, "Son, no one stole your future." The words were simple, but they landed heavily, slicing through the thick emotion clouding the room, and I could see the flicker of resistance flare in our son's eyes. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, because anger had become the shield he used to survive the story he built around himself. He stepped back, pacing again, but this time his movements were tighter, less controlled, as though the truth was crowding him from the inside. The floor groaned under his weight, and the shadows cast by the flickering light stretched across his face like fractured pieces of the pain he had carried in silence. "Then why did you give them everything?" he demanded, his voice cracking in a way that sounded more like a cry than a threat. And for the first time tonight, I saw him not as a man closing in on what he believed he deserved, but as the boy who once clung to my hand on his first day of school, afraid of being left behind. I felt my own voice tremble as I spoke, choosing my words with the gentleness of someone approaching a wounded heart, saying, "We gave what was needed at the time, not because you were never because you were less. He froze in place, as though the sentence hit somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere tender and unprotected, and the silence that followed was no longer sharp or threatening. It was waiting, searching, shifting the tone of the room from confrontation to something far more precarious, the possibility that his rage might crack open into truth. He stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, and for a long moment he didn't speak, only stared at us with an expression that seemed to sift through years of moments, searching for evidence to contradict what I had just said, as though his memories were rearranging themselves inside him. The faint hum of the heater filled the silence, a soft mechanical heartbeat echoing through the tension-heavy room, and when he finally blinked, his eyes glistened with a shine he tried fiercely to hide. My husband shifted his weight slightly, leaning his forearms on his knees, his posture no longer defensive, but grounded, inviting truth instead of conflict. And in that subtle shift, the energy in the room gentled just enough to breathe, without fear of shattering the moment. Our son dragged a hand across his face, pressing the heel of his palm into his brow, as if trying to push back the rush of emotions breaking through the armor he had built. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not soft, but stripped of the performative anger that had fueled his earlier threats. You helped them. You paid for their degrees, their homes. You were always there when they fell, he said, each accusation laced with an aching kind of longing rather than rage. And it was then I understood the truth, sitting in the center of his resentment. He didn't envy what they had. He envied the version of us he believed they received. My heart tightened, a slow, painful squeeze that reached deep, and I felt my own voice tremble under the weight of decades as I said, we weren't there for them more. We were there for them differently, because their struggles were different. He flinched slightly at the word struggles, as if the idea that his siblings had battles too disrupted the narrative he had held on to. And I saw his lower lip quiver just before he bit down on it, trying to maintain the last remnants of the hardness he came here with tonight. And mine, he whispered, quiet enough that it almost dissolved into the air. And that single question, small, aching, devastating, shifted the entire room. Because beneath all the threatening, beneath the talk of lawyers and wills and entitlement, what he truly wanted wasn't wealth. It was acknowledgement. My husband inhaled deeply, preparing to answer the question that had waited years to be spoken aloud. And I felt the room hold its breath with him, waiting for the truth that would either soothe the wound in our son's heart or expose how deeply it had been neglected. My husband lifted his gaze slowly, and in the quiet shift of his eyes, I saw decades of fatherhood gather themselves. Every regret, every pride, every moment he wished he had done differently. And when he finally answered, his voice carried a depth that softened even the shadows in the room. Your struggles, he said carefully, were never small. They were simply hidden behind your strength. Our son stiffened, as though the words reached a place inside him he had spent years barricading, and the muscles along his jaw twitched with conflicted disbelief. The lamp's warm glow flickered across his face, illuminating the faint tremor in his mouth, the subtle break in his composure, and suddenly, the anger he'd carried like armor began to look too heavy for him, too sharp against the softness trying to surface beneath it. My husband continued, leaning forward with the steady patience of a man trying to reach through years of silence, explaining how our son had always been the one who insisted he was fine, the one who never asked for help, the one who masked every setback with determination so convincing that even we, his parents, believed he didn't need the same safety nets his siblings required. I watched our son swallow hard, his Adam's apple rising sharply like a swallowed cry, and he shook his head once, a trembling, resistant denial that revealed more pain than defiance. "So because I didn't ask, you assumed I didn't need anything," he whispered, the sentence cracking at the edges, and hearing the fracture in his voice felt like watching something long buried finally surface. I reached across the table slowly, placing my hand near his, not touching yet, only offering, and said, "We didn't assume. We believed you. You always acted unbreakable, and we feared interfering would feel like doubting your strength." His breath hitched, shallow and unsteady, and he stared at the floor as if trying to hold back a wave of emotions he had kept locked away for years. The silence grew heavy again, but no longer with threat. This time it pulsed with revelation, with the fragile, trembling truth of a child who had felt unseen, not because he was ignored, but because he hid too well. And as he lifted his eyes to meet ours once more, I sensed the shift fully, a crack in the storm, a moment where hurt rose above anger, begging to finally be understood. He stood frozen, as though my words had struck a chord, so deep it stole the movement from his limbs, and the soft rise and fall of his chest became the only sign that time had not fully stopped inside him. His eyes flickered with a wild mixture of recognition and resistance, as if he were finally seeing the truth, but fighting it with every instinct shaped by years of quietly nursed resentment. The dim light above us buzzed faintly, vibrating against the heavy stillness that filled the room like thick fog, and in that strange silence, I could almost hear the echo of his childhood, the unspoken questions, the brave little smiles, the silent endurance he mistook for strength, because he believed needing us was a burden we shouldn't carry. He brushed a trembling hand against his face, frustrated at the weakness slipping through the cracks of his hardened shell, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened by a lifetime of words swallowed instead of shared. "I shouldn't have had to ask," he whispered, aching, bitter, vulnerable all at once, and the confession pierced the room with a raw honesty that made my heart twist painfully inside my chest. My husband shifted closer, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of a father reclaiming his place, and he answered with a steady calm that wrapped around the moment like a stabilizing frame, saying, "No child should have to ask, but no parent can see what a child hides." Our son squeezed his eyes shut, and for a brief moment, I saw him as a boy again, standing outside his classroom with a forced smile, insisting he wasn't nervous, pretending he wasn't disappointed when his science project didn't place, hiding the tremble in his voice when he told us he didn't care about the scholarship he narrowly missed. Each memory layered itself across the man before me, revealing how deeply he had masked every wound, how fiercely he had maintained the illusion of strength till it became the only identity he trusted. He opened his eyes again, and this time they shined not with anger, but with a tremor of truth trying desperately to break through. "I thought you saw me," he said, voice cracking like thin glass. "I thought you just didn't think I deserved the same support." The sentence landed like a quiet explosion inside my chest, scattering years of misunderstood moments into sharp clarity. This wasn't entitlement, wasn't greed, wasn't a demand for money. It was the cry of a son who believed he had been loved less. And as he stood there, breath unsteady, pain written in the tightness of his posture, I realized we were no longer facing a threat. We were facing a heart that had been waiting too long to be heard, trembling at the edge of a truth he no longer had the strength to hide. The moment he said, "I thought you just didn't think I deserved the same support," something inside me fractured, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet, devastating sound of truth settling into place after years of being misplaced. And I felt my breath tremble as I watched him stand there, shoulders tense, eyes glistening with the weight of a belief he had carried alone for far too long. The room felt colder, as though the house itself understood the gravity of what had finally surfaced, and my husband inhaled slowly, gathering a steadiness around himself like armor forged not for battle, but for truth. He rose from his chair with deliberate care, the floor groaning beneath his measured steps, and approached our son not with confrontation, but with the presence of a father reclaiming the space between them, stopping only when he stood close enough for his voice to land softly, unavoidably, directly. "You were never undeserving," he said, his tone low but unwavering, and the certainty in his words filled the room like a quiet storm breaking open. Our son's throat bobbed with a swallowed breath, his gaze flicking to the side, as if unable to withstand the force of being truly seen for the first time in years. His hands, once formed into fists of resolve and resentment, now hung uselessly at his sides, trembling with a truth that burned too deeply to hide behind anger any longer. My husband continued, explaining how the will, this document that had fueled such pain, was built not from favoritism, but from necessity, crafted in moments when the other children faced crises he never told us he was facing too, and how the decisions were always meant to be revisited with all of them together. When life had finally settled, our son blinked rapidly, a tear escaping before he could catch it, and the shock on his face revealed a heartbreaking realization. He had built an entire identity around the belief that he was the forgotten one, and now that belief was cracking wide open. "Then why didn't you tell me that?" he whispered, voice trembling with both relief and accusation. And I stepped forward, unable to remain seated any longer, saying gently, "Because you always insisted you were fine, and we didn't want to make you feel small by doubting your strength." His breath hitched at the word strength, as though hearing it reframed his entire understanding of the past, and he shook his head slowly, overwhelmed by the truth he had never prepared himself to face. Anger that had once filled the room like a suffocating fog was thinning now, dissipating into something more fragile, more human, and I realized that we were finally standing at the edge of what he truly came here for. Not money, not assets, not the will, but the chance to understand why he had felt invisible in the home that was supposed to be his first shelter hope. You are finding this story close to your heart? If so, then please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It helps me bring these heartwarming stories to you. Let's move to the story. My son stood there, breathing as though each inhale carried the weight of years he had never allowed himself to speak. And as the last traces of anger drained from his expression, something far more fragile emerged, a bewildered sorrow, as if he were suddenly realizing how much of his life had been shaped by a misunderstanding he never dared question. The lamp flickered again, casting a soft tremor of light across his face, illuminating the way his eyes drifted toward the floor, unfocused, searching for stability in a truth that unsettled the very ground beneath him. My husband stepped back just a little, giving him space without abandoning the closeness they had finally reclaimed, and the gentleness of that small gesture seemed to unravel something deep in our son. His shoulders softened, his posture slumped, and for the first time since he walked through our door tonight, he looked tired. "So all this time," he murmured, voice barely scraping through the stillness, "I was angry over a story I created in my own head." His hands lifted to his temples, pressing against them, as though trying to hold back the flood of realizations crashing into him. And I took a single step forward, allowing my presence to quietly anchor him without overwhelming him. "Not a story," I said gently, "a fear, and fears grow when they stay hidden." He closed his eyes, a visible ripple of pain moving through him as the truth settled deeper. And when he spoke again, the strength in his voice had dissolved into something raw and unshielded. "I didn't want to seem weak," he confessed, the admission trembling with shame. "I thought if I asked for help, you'd see me differently, that you'd think I wasn't worth investing in." My husband's face softened with a grief only parents understand, the grief that comes from realizing a child suffered in silence while you believed they were thriving. And he reached out slowly, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on our son's shoulder. "We would have given you the world if you had told us you needed even a piece of it," he said, voice thick with truth. Our son's breath broke, a sharp, shaking sound that filled the room with a vulnerability that had waited years to be heard. And as he finally lifted his gaze to meet ours, the storm that had brought him here no longer burned in his eyes. It trembled, because now, standing before us in the dim glow of our living room, he wasn't the man who demanded a share of the will. He was the child who had grown up believing his worth was quieter, smaller, easier to overlook, and he was finally allowing himself to ask if that had ever truly been the case. He stood there with my husband's hand resting gently on his shoulder, and the fragile stillness that settled over him felt like the trembling pause before a long frozen truth finally thawed. His eyes shimmered with a mixture of disbelief and grief, as if he were seeing his own life from a distance for the first time, realizing how many choices, how many assumptions, how many hardened beliefs had been built on shadows rather than understanding. His breath wavered uneven, and when he stepped back slightly, the faint scuff of his shoe against the wooden floor sounded like the quiet unraveling of years of emotional armor, shedding pieces he no longer had the strength or desire to carry. My husband didn't move away, didn't press closer. He simply stayed present, steady, a quiet anchor that reminded our son that he was no longer navigating this moment alone. And I watched the tension in our son's posture loosen, as though he felt that presence more deeply than he expected. "I wasted so much time," he murmured, voice catching on the edges of regret, and the heaviness of those words sank into the room with a quiet force that made my throat tighten. I stepped forward, my hand lifting instinctively, but stopping just before touching him, leaving him the choice to accept comfort instead of assuming he wanted it. And I said softly, "Time isn't lost when truth finally arrives. It's reclaimed." His eyes flicked upward, raw, searching, and for a moment he looked at me with the same expression he had when he was small and overwhelmed, that silent plea for reassurance he never allowed himself to voice as an adult. The lamp's glow brushed across his cheek, catching a tear he didn't bother to wipe away this time, and he let out a shaky exhale, as if surrendering to the reality he had spent years resisting. "I thought I wasn't your priority," he whispered, each word trembling with old wounds, and my husband answered before I could, his tone deep, steady, threaded with a father's sorrow and certainty. "You were always our priority. You just hid your struggles so well. We didn't know where to meet you." Our son closed his eyes, a visible tremor running through him at the gentle truth. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely more than a breath. "I don't know how to fix this." The confession, small, aching, devastating, seemed to quiet the entire house, and I finally extended my hand the rest of the way, not forcing, simply offering, saying gently, "You start by letting yourself be seen." He hesitated, the remnants of his fear flickering across his expression, and then slowly, cautiously, he placed his hand in mine. The warmth of his palm, trembling yet seeking, felt like the first fragile step out of a darkness he had lived in far longer than we ever realized. And in that moment, I understood the truth. Tonight wasn't about a will, or inheritance, or threats. It was about finally reaching the son who had been lost to his own silence. I stood frozen in the driveway as the night wrapped around the house like something alive, breathing cold against the windows, while everything inside me burned hot and trembling. Mark paced beside me, rubbing his hands together, every stride tight with worry. Yet every time he looked my way, I saw the quiet storm in his eyes, the unmistakable readiness of a man preparing for confrontation he wished he didn't have to face. And just when I opened my mouth to tell him maybe we should turn back, the front door slammed open so violently the porch light shuddered, and there stood our son, Thomas, shoulders squared, jaw tight, eyes flashing like he'd been rehearsing his anger for hours. And he pointed at us like we were intruders, not parents, shouting, "You really thought you could control me with that, Will? You thought fear would make me behave? No, tonight you're going to listen." And his voice carried through the neighborhood in a way that made even the trees seem to recoil. But Mark stepped forward without hesitation, his calmness so sharp it almost cut through Thomas's fury. And he said, "Then talk, son, because this ends tonight." And the moment he said it, the wind stopped, the world hushed, and Thomas's face shifted ever so slightly, not softer, but startled, as if he hadn't expected us to walk into the storm. Willingly, he jabbed a finger toward the house and hissed that we should get inside, that he wasn't going to argue in the open where the world could see our family shame. And though every instinct in me screamed to stay where the sky was wide and neighbors were listening behind their curtains, I felt Mark's hand slide over mine, a silent promise, a vow, a message without words. We end his fear by ending ours first. So we walked inside together, into the dim hallway where the lights flickered like old candles, trembling at the edge of existence. And the instant Thomas shut the door behind us, the click of the lock echoed down the corridor like a trigger being pulled. But Mark didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't drop his gaze for even a heartbeat. And as I stood there between the man I married and the boy I raised, I felt something shifting, something inevitable, something irreversible, as though the house itself knew we were walking into the moment where a family breaks or rebuilds itself from ashes. The air inside the living room felt thick, almost syrupy, as if every unsaid word from the last 20 years had condensed into something we had to breathe. And Thomas stood in the center of it, arms folded, chin lifted, pacing like a man preparing to deliver a verdict, rather than speak to the two people who once held his tiny hands while he learned to walk. And he launched into his speech without hesitation, anger spilling out of him in sharp, ragged edges, accusations of favoritism, of control, of promises he claims we broke, but we never even knew existed. He told us we didn't respect him, didn't value him, didn't treat him like someone who deserved a future. And Mark listened so intently, I could almost hear the grind of his self-control, his jaw barely moving as he said, "Thomas, the will wasn't punishment, it was protection." But Thomas scoffed, stomped closer, his shadow stretching across the rug like some furious creature of its own, and he yelled that we were lying, that we wanted to keep him dependent, that we never cared if he stood on his own 2 feet. And every word hit my chest like cold rain, not because it hurt, but because I realized he actually believed it. Mark finally rose from the sofa with a slow, deliberate steadiness that made the room tighten, and he stepped so close to Thomas that their reflections merged in the dark window behind them, his voice deep and low as he said, "You think we fear you? No, we fear losing you to the person you're pretending to be." And for the first time, Thomas's expression cracked, a flicker of confusion, almost guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He shoved a folder onto the coffee table: bank statements, debt notices, a mess of numbers he never told us about, and snarled that he needed the inheritance now, not later, not someday when we're gone. And my legs nearly gave way, because suddenly everything made sense. His anger, his desperation, his threats, they were roots tangled in fear, pulling him deeper into a place he didn't know how to escape. Mark's voice softened in a way I'd only heard a handful of times in our entire marriage as he said, "Son, you should have come to us. You didn't need to fight us." But Thomas jerked back, shaking, breath uneven, eyes wild, like he wasn't just battling us, but battling himself. And the weight of that realization settled heavy in my stomach as I understood we weren't just parents confronting a furious son. We were witnesses to a boy who had built a cage from pride and now didn't know how to unlock it. Even as it closed around him, inch by inch, Thomas's breathing turned shallow, almost frantic, as though the walls themselves were tightening around him. And I watched his fingers clench and unclench, like he was holding onto something invisible, some rope, some lifeline, some last shred of pride he refused to release. And Mark took one slow step forward, his voice low and careful, the way a person approaches a wounded animal that might lash out just to hide its pain. But Thomas snapped before a single word could land, shouting that he didn't need our pity, didn't need our parental lectures, didn't need us pretending we were heroes trying to save him. And his voice cracked on that last word, a small fracture that said more than any of his accusations ever had. He turned his back on us, running his hands through his hair, pacing fast, like a man trying to outrun his own reflection. And when he finally whirled around again, his eyes were wet, not with softness, but with the fury of a drowning man furious at the tide. And he barked, "Do you know what it's like to feel like a disappointment every single day? No matter what you do, it's never enough." And the confession hit the room like lightning, illuminating every shadow we had tiptoed around for years. But before I could speak, Mark moved closer, slow, grounded, steady, and he said gently, "We never asked you to be perfect. We asked you to be honest." And that simple sentence made Thomas flinch, as though someone had struck him. He pointed at the documents again, voice hoarse now, telling us he'd made a few mistakes, that the wrong people were pressuring him, that he needed money fast or everything would collapse. And suddenly, I saw it, the fear behind the anger, the shame behind the shouting, the boy behind the man who didn't know how to ask for help without hiding behind threats. The silence that followed was suffocating, a deep quiet that seemed to pull every memory we'd ever shared into the room at once. And I felt something inside me break, not in despair, but in recognition, because this wasn't a son trying to steal our legacy. This was a son trying to survive his own decisions, tangled in a world he wasn't ready for. Mark reached out, placing one firm, steady hand on Thomas's shoulder, anchoring him as if he'd sensed the storm gathering beneath his skin. And in that moment, the anger that had filled the house began to shift, trembling at the edges, like a wave deciding whether to crash or recede. And for the first time that night, I saw a flicker in Thomas's eyes, a question, a plea, the beginning of surrender. But before anyone could breathe into the moment, a sudden knock on the door shattered everything, loud, heavy, deliberate, and all three of us froze as the echo traveled through the house like a warning. Whatever was happening inside, something outside had come to claim its part in it. The knock came again, slow, weighted, the kind that doesn't ask for entry, but announces inevitability. And Thomas's entire body jolted, as though someone had pulled a string hidden deep inside him, his eyes widening in a way that told me the visitor wasn't unexpected, but unwelcome, deeply unwelcome. and I watched his shoulders tense, his jaw lock, his breath turn thin as he whispered something under it that sounded like a prayer swallowed by panic. Mark stepped in front of me out of instinct, his stance protective, steady. But Thomas raised both hands sharply, telling him not to open the door. Not yet. Not like this. And suddenly, he looked younger than I'd seen him in years, a frightened boy trapped in a grown man's consequences, eyes darting to the windows, to the hall, to the documents still lying on the table, as though each one was a fuse, leading to a fire he'd hidden for far too long. The third knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a heavy strike, a demand, a claim, and it echoed through the house with a chilling finality that made the lights seem dimmer, the walls colder, the air thinner. And when Thomas finally turned to us, his voice broke around the edges as he said, "Don't say a word, don't sign anything, don't trust what they tell you." And the urgency in his tone sliced through the fear, revealing something rawer, something more desperate, something that tasted like truth. Mark narrowed his eyes, studying him, trying to read the pieces falling apart behind his trembling facade. And I reached out, touching Thomas's arm just lightly, feeling the violent tremor running beneath his skin, as though his heart was knocking inside him with the same force as the door. And I whispered his name, hoping he would look at me, really look at me. But he didn't. He just stepped back, wiped his face with both hands, and drew in a breath, so shaky it hurt to hear. Then the final knock came, louder than the others, a brutal thud followed by a low voice calling, and the sound wrapped around us like a cold hand curling at the nape of the neck. And Thomas finally whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "They're not here for you, they're here for me." And before either of us could speak or steady him or pull him close, he moved toward the door with a kind of resigned determination, as though he'd run out of ways to hide, out of lies to tell, out of time entirely. And the moment his fingers touched the handle, a silence fell so absolute it felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to finally walk in. The door opened only halfway before a tall, broad figure forced it wider with a single shove, stepping into our foyer with the heavy confidence of someone who'd long stopped asking permission for anything. And the moment his eyes landed on Thomas, something in the room shifted, an invisible tightening, a quiet surrender, a recognition that this man, this stranger with a storm carved into his expression, held a piece of our son's fate in a grip we couldn't yet see. He didn't look at me or at Mark at first, only at Thomas, scanning him with a slow, assessing gaze that made my son's shoulders collapse inward, like a structure losing its scaffolding all at once. And when the man finally spoke, his voice was deep, unhurried, disturbingly calm as he said, "You weren't supposed to come here," as though our home was now a place Thomas had no right to seek refuge in. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the man stepped closer, closing the distance with a precision that made me inch nearer to Mark, my fingers curling around his arm as instinct urged me to shield my family, even though the danger was already inside the walls, already breathing our air. The man finally turned his head toward us, and his eyes softened for half a second, softened, not out of sympathy, but out of calculation, and he gave a polite nod that felt entirely out of place in the tension thickening around us, saying, "Mr. and Mrs. Harper," in a tone that suggested he had practiced our names long before this night, long before this moment, long before Thomas had reached the point of desperation that led to this knock. Mark straightened, his voice steady but edged with warning as he asked who he was and what business he had with our son. But instead of answering, the man simply smiled a small, controlled smile that never reached his eyes, and placed a thick envelope on the nearest table, tapping it once with 2 fingers, as though sealing a deal none of us agreed to. And Thomas winced at the sight of it, the way a person flinches when they recognize a weapon aimed at their own future. The man spoke again, quiet, almost kindly, telling Thomas he had 24 hours left, that deals couldn't be delayed forever, that debts didn't vanish just because he'd run home. And the way Thomas's knees seemed to weaken made my heart twist with a fear so sharp I had to steady myself on the edge of the sofa. Mark stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the man and our son, the silent declaration of a father reclaiming his ground. But the stranger didn't budge, didn't waver, didn't even blink. He simply said, "Your son knows what's in that envelope, and he knows what happens if he doesn't follow through," before turning toward the door with the same unwavering calm he arrived with, leaving behind a silence so dense it felt like a shadow settling into the corners of the room. And as the door closed behind him, Thomas sank onto the chair with a trembling exhale, finally whispering the words that shattered me more than any threat ever could. "I dragged you into something I can't get out of, not alone." Thomas sat there with his elbows on his knees, hands pressed to his face, his breath shaking through the spaces between his fingers, as though he was trying to hide the sound of his own breaking. And when he finally lowered his hands enough for me to see his eyes, I realized they were the eyes of a man who had been running for so long. He no longer remembered what solid ground felt like, and the silence in the room grew heavier, colder, as if waiting for him to release the truth he had kept buried beneath anger, pride, and fear. Mark crouched in front of him, not touching him yet, simply grounding himself at Thomas's level in a way only a father who refused to give up on his child would do. And he said gently, with a voice steady enough to hold the room together, "Tell us everything." But Thomas shook his head, gripping the edges of the chair as if that alone could keep him from falling apart, whispering that he hadn't wanted us to see this side of him, hadn't wanted us to know how badly he had failed, how deeply he had sunk, how desperately he had tried to handle debts, threats, and mistakes that had spiraled far beyond his control. I felt myself inch closer, drawn by the instinct that had lived in me since the day he was born, the instinct to step between him and whatever darkness was clawing after him. And the moment I touched his shoulder, just lightly, he shuddered, as though kindness had become foreign, unfamiliar, almost painful. And then the story tumbled out of him in fragments. The investment that wasn't real, the friend who wasn't a friend, the loan that came with hidden strings, the documents he signed without understanding the severity of the trap he was stepping into, the deadlines he missed, and finally, the men who didn't deal in warnings twice. Mark listened with a stillness I had only ever seen in him during the worst storms of our lives, a stillness that wasn't absence, but concentration, calculation, love forged into resolve. And when Thomas whispered that the envelope held the final notice, 24 hours, or they take collateral, something inside me froze so violently that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Mark stood then, slowly, with the steady rise of a man who had decided on something before the room even knew a decision was needed, and he picked up the envelope without hesitation, weighing it in his hand, as if assessing not just the papers inside, but the cost of protecting our son, of stepping into a battlefield that wasn't his, but had become his the moment Thomas walked through our door trembling and lost. Thomas tried to stand, to stop him, insisting that if Mark stepped in he would only make things worse, insisting that this mess belonged to him alone. But Mark placed a firm hand on his shoulder, anchoring him back into the chair, and said, in a low, unwavering voice that carried the quiet authority of a man who has stood between danger and his family more times than he cared to remember. You're our son. We stand with you, even in the dark. And the strength in those words wrapped around the room like a shield, like a promise, like a line drawn in the sand that none of us fully understood yet. But just as I felt the faintest glimmer of hope settle inside me, Thomas's expression shifted, fear morphing into dread, dread into realization, and he whispered, with a voice so faint it chilled me, "Dad, you don't understand. They don't want money anymore. They want the house." The words, "they want the house," didn't just land, they detonated, sending a shock through the room so sharp it felt like the air itself recoiled. And for a moment, none of us moved. None of us breathed, as though even the house was listening, holding its wooden frame stiff against the storm Thomas had finally named. Mark's hand, still gripping the envelope, tightened just slightly, the faint crunch of paper breaking the silence, and he lifted his head slowly, his eyes narrowing with a focus I had only seen once before, the kind of focus a man carries when he is preparing to protect everything he has ever built, everything he has ever loved, and everything he is terrified of losing. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice unsteady as he explained that the loan had been secured, not with cash, not with collateral he actually owned, but with a forged claim of interest in our property, a claim the men now intended to use legally or forcefully if he failed to comply. And hearing it felt like watching a storm gather over our home in real time, clouds thickening, winds circling, shadows stretching across the walls, as though the danger had already seeped through the cracks in the foundation. I stepped back slightly, my hand brushing the edge of the dining table, the wood trembling under my palm, not because it was weak, but because because the thought of losing this home, the place where we raised him, the place built on decades of memories, the place that held every version of our family, struck me with a grief so deep I had to grip the chair to steady myself. And Thomas saw it, saw the pain in my eyes, and his own expression collapsed, guilt crashing over him in a wave that left him breathless. He stood too quickly, almost stumbling, insisting he would fix it, insisting he would find a way, insisting he would leave if leaving meant saving us from the consequences he had dragged into our lives. But Mark held up a hand, a quiet command that halted everything, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a calm so deliberate it sent a shiver down my spine, a calm forged not from acceptance, but from decision, from strategy, from the emerging blueprint of a plan he hadn't yet revealed. Thomas tried to argue, tried to warn us that these men didn't respond to courage or reason or negotiation, but Mark stepped closer, placing both hands on Thomas's shoulders, steadying him with a confidence so rooted it seemed to slow the very air around us. And he said, "You came home for a reason, son. You came because you still believe this is a place worth protecting. And so do we." And something flickered between them, an old bond, cracked but not broken, strained but not severed, before Mark lifted the envelope and set it firmly in the center of the table, like a challenge laid at the feet of fate itself. I watched him draw a slow breath, watched his posture shift, watched the full weight of his resolve settle into the room like an anchor, and he finally said, "We're not losing this house, not to fear, not to threats, not to anyone." And the moment those words left his lips, Thomas's eyes filled with a fragile, trembling hope, small, uncertain, but alive. Just as the floorboards creaked near the front door, a subtle sound that made all three of us turn in unison, realizing with a cold, creeping certainty that we might not be alone in the house anymore. The creak near the door wasn't loud, but it was decisive, like the house itself exhaled in warning. and Mark moved first, stepping forward with deliberate calm. The kind a man uses when he refuses to show fear, even as it begins tightening like a fist around his ribs. And when he opened the door, the cold night air slipped inside, carrying nothing but darkness, emptiness, and the unsettling realization that whoever or whatever had been there was gone now, leaving behind only the whisper of danger threading through the quiet. Thomas stood beside me, shoulders tense, eyes scanning every shadow as though expecting those men to step through the walls themselves. But as Mark closed the door gently, locking it with a steady hand, a shift settled through the room, not relief, but alignment, a uniting of all three of us in the face of what we knew would come with the morning. Thomas finally sank onto the sofa, his breath slowing, his voice quiet as he whispered that he never meant for any of this, never meant for fear to take root in the home that once held all his happiest memories. And I sat beside him, guiding his trembling hand between mine, telling him softly that love does not disappear. When mistakes are made, it deepens, hardens, strengthens, especially when tested by shadows that try to pull a family apart. Mark joined us, leaning forward with purpose, as he said we would face the debt collectors in the daylight, not with fear, but with truth, law, and witnesses, because he had already seen through the man's false confidence and recognized that intimidation was their only real weapon. And when Thomas's eyes lifted, hope flickered again, this time with more steadiness, more substance, as though the weight he carried had finally begun to shift from crushing to shared. The rest of the night unfolded in quiet steadiness, papers reviewed, plans formed, calls prepared for the morning. And by sunrise, when the men returned expecting a frightened family to hand over a home built on decades of memories, they instead found a united front, evidence of fraud, and police already waiting in the driveway. And in that moment, watching the men realize their grip on our lives had snapped, I felt something inside me lift. Breath I had been holding for too long finally released. Thomas stood between us when it was over, exhausted but lighter. And when he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me," I felt every ache of the night melt into something warm, steady, unbroken, because this house wasn't merely walls and wood. It was the place where we stood up for one another, even when fear tried to make us forget who we were. And as the sun rose against the windows, washing the rooms in gold, I knew we had not only saved our home, we had reclaimed our son. If you like my story and it hits your heart, then don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button. It motivates me a lot to share more with you.